Clara Whitmore slammed both hands flat on the wooden table so hard the tin cups rattled and the room went dead silent. "You will not touch that flower." Her voice did not shake. "Not one handful, not tonight." The foreman, a tall, weathered man named Gus Taggart, stood across from her with his arms crossed and his jaw set hard, looking at her the way men like him always looked at women like her, like she was something that needed to be managed or moved aside or simply ignored until she gave up and went away. He looked at her worn dress, her heavy frame, her round face flushed from the heat of a kitchen that barely worked, and he made every calculation a man like him knew how to make in about 4 seconds flat. He figured she'd fold. She didn't fold. "Ma'am," he said, dropping the word like it was supposed to settle something, "I've been running this ranch's supplies for 6 years. I know what we got and what we don't got, and what we got ain't enough for you to go wasting on whatever you think you're about to cook up in there. Half them boys would eat jerky and be grateful. Half them boys," Clara said, and her voice was steady as creekstone, "have been eating jerky for 9 days. You want to keep running this ranch, Mr. Taggart. You're going to need men who can still lift their arms. Now step back from my pantry." Nobody in that kitchen moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Gus Taggart stepped back. He didn't know why he did it. He told himself later it was because she wasn't worth the argument. But the truth he would never say out loud, not even to himself, was that there was something in her eyes that did not leave room for discussion. Not anger, not desperation, something older and quieter than both of those things. Something that had already decided. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, or if you've been with us since the beginning, I want to ask you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about women who weren't supposed to make it, who weren't supposed to matter, who weren't supposed to change anything and did anyway. And when you're done with that, drop a comment down below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. I want to see your city in that comment section. We'll be right here waiting for you now. Let's go back to Wyoming. Let's go back to 1882. Let's go back to the day Clara Whitmore walked into the Broken Spur Ranch with nothing but a bag of flour, a worn-out recipe book, and 31 years of a life that had not been kind to her and changed every single thing that was about to happen next. The Broken Spur sat about 14 miles outside of Harlan's Creek, Wyoming, and by the summer of 1882, it looked exactly like what it was, a ranch that had given up on itself. The fences held, mostly. The cattle were still there, thin but present. The bunkhouse stood because the men inside it were too tired to let it fall. But everything else, the morale, the rhythm, the sense that there was something worth working toward at the end of a long day, all of that had quietly bled out somewhere in the past 2 years, the way water bleeds out of cracked clay. Nobody talked about what happened to Mrs. Brooks. It wasn't that they'd forgotten. It was that remembering cost something nobody on the Broken Spur could afford anymore. Nathaniel Brooks had been running this land for 11 years. He was 38 years old and built like a man who had never once in his life taken the easy road broad through the shoulders, lean in the way men go lean when they've worked through their softness. With hands so calloused they barely registered cold anymore, and a face that had been weathered into something angular and unreadable. He wasn't cruel. That was the thing people got wrong about Nate Brooks. He wasn't mean-spirited or small. He was just closed. Like a door that had been shut so long the wood had swollen into the frame, and nobody, including the man himself, was quite sure it could open anymore. He'd been through 2 cooks in 8 months. The first one lasted 6 weeks before deciding that frontier Wyoming was no place for a man of his culinary sensibilities, which turned out to be a description that nobody on the Broken Spur had any patience for, but they let him go without much trouble. The second one lasted 3 months and might have lasted longer, but he took to drinking Nate's whiskey and shorting the supply orders and pocketing the difference. And when Nate found out about it, he didn't yell. He just said very quietly, "Pack your things tonight." And the cook understood from the way Nate said it that tonight meant tonight. After that, the men made do. Gus Taggart, who had run supplies and logistics for the ranch since the beginning, managed the provisions. The cowboys took turns at the stove when they had to. Nobody was happy about it. Nobody was fed the way they needed to be fed. Work on a cattle ranch in Wyoming in the heat of summer is not light work. It is the kind of labor that reaches into your bones and takes something out of you every single day, and the only way to put it back is rest and food, and the men were running short on both. It was Gus who placed the notice. He'd done it without asking Nate, which was technically outside his authority, but Gus had been with Nate long enough to know when something needed doing without being asked. And the situation with the food had gotten to a point where men were starting to make mistakes. Tired mistakes. The kind that cost you cattle, or cost you a fence line, or cost you something worse. The notice ran in the Harlan's Creek Courier and in 2 other papers in the county. It was plain and it was honest. It said the Broken Spur Ranch was looking for a cook. Room and board provided. Steady wages for the right person. Experience required. Apply at the ranch directly. They got 4 responses. 3 of them Gus dismissed within 10 minutes of conversation. One was a boy barely 17 who'd never cooked for more than his own family. Another was a man who showed up already drunk at 2 in the afternoon. The third was a woman who seemed capable enough but made clear in the first 5 minutes that she had opinions about the way a ranch kitchen ought to be organized that she intended to enforce immediately and with some force. And while Gus privately respected that, he also knew it would create a problem with the men that he didn't have the energy to manage. The 4th response was Clara Whitmore. She arrived on a Thursday morning in the back of a supply wagon that was heading out to the Broken Spur anyway. Because she'd made arrangements with the driver in town, paid him 50 cents, she could barely spare to carry her the 14 miles rather than wait for another opportunity. She had 1 bag, a cloth bag, dark blue, worn at the seams, packed with everything she owned that was worth carrying. She was 27 years old, though she looked older, the way women look older when their lives have moved fast and moved hard. She was heavy-set in the way that was visible from 20 yards out, full through the face and through the body. With thick arms and a solid build that some men on that ranch would spend the next 2 weeks making jokes about, and would spend the rest of their time on the Broken Spur learning to regret. She climbed down from that wagon without waiting for help. Set her bag on the ground. Looked at the ranch for a long moment, looked at the bunkhouse and the fences and the dusty yard and the main house sitting back from everything else, with its windows that needed washing and its porch that had a board going soft on the left side. Looked at all of it with those steady brown eyes that took things in and gave nothing back. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the house. Gus met her at the door. He looked her over. She let him. "You're the one who wrote about the cooking position," he said. "I am," she said. "You got experience cooking for large groups." "I cooked for the Harlan family over in Casper 4 years," she said. 12 people, 3 meals a day, plus whatever they needed for visitors and gatherings. Before that, I kept house and cooked for a boarding house in Cheyenne for 3 years. 7 to 14 residents, depending on the season. Gus nodded slowly. Regular. Sometimes more during roundup. "That's manageable," she said. "Kitchen's not in great shape." "Neither is this porch," she said, and looked at the softboard, "but it's holding." "Show me the kitchen." He showed her the kitchen. It was bad. That was the honest word for it. The stove had a problem with its draft that made it smoke when you pushed it too hard, and somewhere in the past few months, someone had managed to crack one of the grates in a way that affected how the heat distributed, which meant everything cooked unevenly if you didn't compensate for it, and compensating for it required knowing about it, which the rotating parade of exhausted cowboys who'd been taking turns at that stove did not. The shelves were in disorder. The pantry was lower than it should have been at this point in the summer, though Clara didn't say anything about that yet. The counter space was limited. One of the window hinges was broken, so the window either stayed shut entirely or had to be propped open with a tin. Clara walked through it slowly, opened the pantry, counted what was there, checked the stove, opened the firebox and looked at the grate. The draft problem, she said, not as a question. Yeah, Gus said. We've been working around it. I can fix it, she said. He looked at her. The stove, the draft issue. It's likely a buildup in the flue or a gap in the collar. I've seen it before, I can fix it. He kept looking at her. You can fix a stove, Mr. Taggart, she said, and turned to face him fully, and he noticed again that thing in her eyes, that settled, decide quality. I have fixed a great many things in my life that other people told me were not my business to fix. Now, time do the men eat. Gus hired her on the spot. Not because he was entirely confident, but because she was already looking at the stove, like she was planning what tools she'd need, and something in his gut told him that who looked at a stove like that not with frustration, not with complaint, but with problem solving was probably worth the risk. He told her the wage. She accepted without argument, but the way she accepted it told him she thought she was worth more, and he filed that away because he thought she was probably right. What he did not do was introduce her warmly to the men. That, as it turned out, was the first of several things that did not go the way anybody expected. The cowboys were in from the morning's work by the time Gus brought her out to the yard to give a general introduction. There were 8 of them, 8 regular hands, ranging from a boy named Pete Duval, who was 19 and still growing into his boots, to a man called Holloway who was somewhere north of 50 and had been working cattle since before most of the others were born. They were dusty and tired and in various states of impatience about the midday situation, which had so far that day consisted of cold biscuits left from the day before and the understanding that somebody was going to have to figure out lunch. They saw Clara and the reaction moved through the group like a slow wave. Not violent, not outright hostile, just dismissive. The kind of dismissal that doesn't even bother to be mean because it doesn't take the subject seriously enough. One of the men, a hand named Dale Renfrew, who was 24 years old and had the particular confidence of a young man who had never yet been seriously wrong about anything important enough to teach him better, said something under his breath to the man next to him. Clara did not hear exactly what he said, but she saw the man next to him grin. She kept her face still. This is Clara Whitmore, Gus said. She'll be cooking for us going forward, starting tonight. There was a welcoming. Starting tonight? Said Holloway. What about today? What about today? Gus said. We haven't eaten since this morning, Holloway said. And what we ate this morning wasn't what I'd call a meal. What's the situation for the midday? Gus looked at Clara. Clara said, give me an hour. An hour, Dale Renfrew said. And now the grin was fully on his face and he wasn't hiding it. For what? What's she going to do with what's in that kitchen in an hour? Something edible, Clara said, which is more than you've managed. The grin disappeared. Pete Duval made a sound that was almost a laugh and turned it into a cough when Dale shot him a look. Clara went back to the kitchen. She was not angry. That was the thing about Clara, she'd been through enough of this particular kind of dismissal that it didn't reach her the way it once had. When she was younger, it had. When she was younger, the looks and the murmurs and the comments about her size, her appearance, her presumption in occupying space and expecting to be taken seriously, those things had cut through her in ways she'd spent years learning to close up. Not to forget. You didn't forget. But you built something between the cut and the bleeding. Something tough and quiet, and after a while the cuts didn't go as deep. What she felt walking back into that kitchen was not anger. It was something closer to purpose. She had an hour. She had flour and some baking powder and salt. She had half an onion and some dried beans she'd found in a back corner of the pantry that had been overlooked, and a small piece of salt pork, and a tin of molasses, and a jar of rendered fat. She had a stove with a broken grate and a draft problem. She got to work. The first thing she did was the stove. She pulled the collar, found the gap just as she'd suspected, a separation at the join that was letting cold air in and disrupting the draw, and she packed it with a piece of damp clay she'd spotted near the water barrel outside. Not a permanent fix, but it would hold long enough to matter. She rebuilt the fire properly, adjusted for the grate problem by placing her heaviest pot on the side that drew heat most consistently, And by the time the fire was going right, she had the beans on and was working the biscuit dough. There's a skill to making something from not much. It's not a glamorous skill, it doesn't announce itself. But it is absolutely a skill, the ability to look at what you have, and not at what you don't have, and to pull something out of it that is more than the sum of its parts. Clara had been practicing that skill since she was 9 years old, and her mother was trying to keep 4 children fed on what a widow, with a small piece of land and no help, could produce. She knew flour the way some people know music, by feel, by instinct, by a knowledge that lived in her hands more than in her head. The biscuits went into the oven on a cast-iron skillet she'd found hanging on the back wall. The beans went into the pot, with the salt pork and the onion and enough water and a pour of molasses that would do something interesting to the flavor as it cooked down. She set the tin she'd found to warming on the side of the stove so the fat could be used for the skillet when the biscuits came out. And then she did something that none of the men expected. She stepped outside and rang the dinner bell, a cracked old thing hanging by the door that nobody had bothered with in months, at exactly 53 minutes. They came in skeptical. Dale Renfrew came in with his arms crossed, already forming whatever he was going to say if the food was bad. Holloway came in with the flat exhaustion of a man who had stopped expecting things to be good and just needed them to be sufficient. Pete Duval came in last, standing near the door like he wasn't sure yet whether he was committed to being in the room. Clara set plates on the table. Biscuits, golden on top and soft in the middle, stacked in a cloth to keep the heat. A pot of beans, thick, smoky from the salt pork, with that molasses running through the bottom of it in a way that made the smell complicated and good. And a small dish of the rendered fat, beaten with a pinch of salt, that could go on the biscuits if a man wanted. Nobody said anything. Then Holloway picked up a biscuit, broke it open, and the steam came out of the middle of it. He put half of it in his mouth. His face did something. "Well," he said, and his voice had lost its flatness. "All right then." That was all he said. But it was enough. The men ate. They ate like men who had been eating bad food for too long and had forgotten this was possible, and the table that had been cold and obligatory became, for about 40 minutes, something else. Something warmer, something that deserved the word gathering. Dale Renfrew didn't say anything about the food. He ate 2 helpings of beans and 4 biscuits, and he didn't say one word. Clara stood at the stove and watched them eat and kept her face still, but something in her chest had settled, the way a knot settles when the right tension is applied to it. She knew what she was doing. She knew how to do it. That was going to have to be enough. Nathaniel Brooks came in late. He always came in late to the midday, because the midday meant leaving whatever needed doing out on the land, and Nate Brooks had a relationship with leaving things undone that could most charitably be described as pathological. He knew this about himself. He did not consider it a problem. He considered it a requirement. He came through the kitchen door, still in his work gloves, and saw the remains of the meal and the woman he didn't recognize standing at his stove, washing a pot. "You're the new cook," he said. Clara turned. "Clara Whitmore, Mr. Taggart hired me this morning." "He told me he was placing a notice," Nate said. "Didn't tell me he'd found someone." "He found someone today," she said. "Your men were getting to a point where they needed a proper meal." "I did what I could with what's in the pantry, but Mr. Brooks, I need to talk to you about the supply situation when you have a moment." He looked at the table, at the empty pot, the stacked plates, at the evidence of a meal that had actually happened. "Gus says you fixed the stove, temporarily. The collar joint needs to be reseated properly." "I can do that, or someone with metalworking skill can do it more permanently, but it'll hold for now." Nate was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that wasn't passive. It was active, like he was running some kind of calculation behind those pale gray eyes. "What's the supply situation? You're low," she said. "Lower than you should be for where we are in the season. I don't know the particulars of how the ordering is managed, but based on what I saw in that pantry today, either the orders have been running short or there's been some loss I'm not aware of. I'd like to go through the supply records with whoever manages them." "That's Gus." Then I'll talk to Gus, she said, but I wanted you to know. You can't feed 8 working men properly on what's in that pantry right now. Tonight I can do it. Tomorrow and after that, I'm going to need a proper order placed. He was still looking at her with that calculating quiet. Then he said, what did you feed them? Biscuits and bean stew. With what was in that pantry? With what was in that pantry? He looked at the table again, at the clean plates. All right, he said. I'll talk to Gus about the records. You'll have a proper order placed within the week. Within 3 days, she said. Or I can't guarantee the quality of what I'm producing. He looked at her sharply, not angry, something more like recalibrating. Within 3 days, he said. Thank you, Mr. Brooks, she said, and turned back to the pot. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than was necessary, then went back out. He told himself he was thinking about the supply order. He was also, without quite meaning to, thinking about the way she'd said within 3 days without apology or hesitation, like she already knew exactly what this ranch needed and had simply decided to state it. He'd had 2 cooks in 8 months who couldn't get through a week without some kind of complaint or crisis. And this woman had been here 4 hours and had already fixed his stove and fed his men and identified a supply problem and demanded he address it on a specific timeline. He went out to find Gus. The supply records were the beginning of something Clara had not fully expected, though she understood later that she probably should have. She sat with Gus that evening at the table in the kitchen after dinner, a dinner that was better than lunch had been, because she'd had more time to work with what was available, and she'd found in a back corner of the root cellar some dried apples that somebody had put up and forgotten. And she'd made a simple pan dessert with them that made Pete Duval's eyes go wide and made even Holloway say something that was almost complimentary, and they went through the supply records together. Gus was a careful man in most respects. His records were generally tidy. But as Clara went through them, running her finger down the columns and doing the arithmetic in her head, she'd always been quick with numbers. A skill that had surprised people throughout her life because they did not expect it from her, and she had learned early not to make that expectation easy for them. She kept finding small discrepancies. Not big ones, nothing that would announce itself. Small ones. The kind that were easy to overlook if you weren't looking for them specifically, or if you trusted the person who'd been managing the orders and saw no reason to question. Mr. Taggart, she said in May, you ordered 40 pounds of flour. That sounds right, he said, and the invoice shows 40 pounds. But the delivery record shows 36, Gus frowned. Could be a mistake on the delivery. Could be, she said. But, look here, March ordered 30 pounds of salt pork. Invoice says 30 pounds. Delivery record shows 27. And in April, she turned the page the cornmeal order. 30 pounds ordered, 28 pounds delivered. Gus was very still, and in February she continued the coffee. Invoice says 20. Delivery record says 18. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the stove settling. That's consistent undershipping, she said. Every month. Small amounts, the kind of amounts you might not notice against the noise of everything else you're managing. Or, Gus said slowly, the kind of amount someone is deliberately keeping small so they don't get noticed. That too. Gus sat back in his chair. His face had gone into something complicated. I should have caught that. You're managing a ranch, she said. You're not an accountant. You were trusting the supplier to deliver what you paid for. Who's the supplier? Based on these invoices, Harlan's Creek General and Feed, run by a man named, she checked the letterhead, Edwin Carr. Gus's expression did something she couldn't quite read. What, she said. Edwin Carr, he said carefully, is Victor Hale's brother-in-law. She looked at him. Victor Hale, he said, is the man who's been making offers on this ranch for the past year. Offers that Nate keeps refusing. Clara set the invoice down on the table very gently. How much is the ranch in debt, she said. Gus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, more than it should be. Less than Hale wants Nate to think. She looked at him. There's things going on with this ranch, Gus said, that are bigger than the supply records, Miss Whitmore. I had a feeling, she said. This is above what you signed on for. I signed on to cook for 8 men and keep this kitchen running, she said. But Mr. Taggart, I've been in situations where people in power use small dishonesties to create big pressure, and I watched it take my family's land away from them. I'm not going to watch it happen again if I can help it. Gus looked at her for a long time. You're going to want to be careful, he said. Victor Hale is not a small problem. I didn't come out to Wyoming looking for small, she said. She picked up her pencil and turned to a fresh page in the ledger she'd brought out. Now, she said, walk me through every delivery record you have from the last 18 months. All of them. Gus looked at the ledger. Then he reached for the box of records on the shelf behind him and began to pull files. They were up until close to midnight. By the time they were done, the picture they'd assembled was not a comfortable one. But it was a clear one, and Clara had learned, in 31 years of a life that had required her to pay attention when other people didn't expect her to, that a clear picture, even an ugly one, was always better than a comfortable fog. She set her pencil down, flexed her hand, looked at the columns she'd filled. He's been bleeding this ranch slowly, she said. The supply shortages alone account for a meaningful portion of the cash flow problem. Not all of it, but enough that when you combine it with what like some irregular land assessment charges in the county records. I don't know much about those, Gus said. I need to see them, she said. Can you get me access to the county records? You'd have to go into Harlan's Creek. The courthouse. I'll need to go into town anyway for the supply order. I'll plan to do it in the same trip. She closed the ledger. Don't say anything to anyone about what we found tonight. Not yet, not until I've seen the county records. I should tell Nate. You will tell Nate, she said. But let me have a few more days first. Right now we have questions. I'd like to have answers before we bring him a problem. Gus looked at her for a long moment. He's not going to like the idea of somebody poking around in his affairs without telling him. He doesn't have to like it, she said. He just has to benefit from it. She stood, picked up her ledger, pushed in her chair. Good night, Mr. Taggart, she said. She walked down the hall to the small room off the kitchen that was hers, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, thinking. She had come to this ranch to cook. She had come because the wage was fair, and because she needed work, and because 14 miles outside of Harlan's Creek was far enough from certain things in town that she didn't have to look at them every day. She had come with her flour and her mother's recipe book, and the skills she'd spent her whole life building. She had not come looking for this, but she recognized it. She recognized the shape of it, the careful, deliberate pressure of someone with power and patience working on someone who had neither in sufficient supply. She had seen it before. She knew how it ended. It was going to end differently here. She lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the Wyoming night outside and the settling of an old ranch house that was still, despite everything, standing. It was still standing. That was something. That was in fact everything. She closed her eyes and slept. She was up before dawn. That was not unusual for Clara. She'd been rising before the sun since she was old enough to be useful in a kitchen, and the habit had never left her. But this morning was different. This morning she woke with the kind of alertness that comes not from rest but from a mind that never fully stopped working, that kept turning the same numbers over and over in the dark the way a river keeps turning a stone. The discrepancies. Edwin Carr. Victor Hale. She dressed in the dark, moved quietly through the hall, and had the stove going and coffee on before any of the men stirred in the bunkhouse. She stood at the counter with her hands wrapped around a tin cup and went back through everything she and Gus had found the night before. But now she was looking at it differently. Not as a set of accounting errors, as a strategy, because that's what it was. She could see that now in the clean clarity of early morning. The undershipping wasn't sloppiness, it was deliberate. Small enough to avoid notice, consistent enough to matter. Take 4 pounds of flour here, 3 pounds of salt pork there, 2 pounds of cornmeal in another month, and over 18 months it added up to something real, both in terms of cash that Edwin Carr was pocketing from the orders, and in terms of a ranch that was quietly, steadily being starved. Not just of food, of margin, of the buffer that kept a working operation from sliding into crisis. And a ranch in crisis was a ranch that might finally be willing to sell. She heard boots on the porch and turned. It was Pete Duvall, the youngest of the hands, looking surprised to find her already there. "Ma'am," he said, stopping in the doorway. "Didn't think anyone be up yet." "Coffee's ready," she said. "Come in." He came in, poured himself a cup, and stood near the stove in the way of young men who aren't quite sure whether they belong in a conversation but don't want to leave it. He was a good-natured boy. She'd noticed that much yesterday. Eager in the way of someone who hadn't yet been disappointed enough times to make him cautious. "You really fixed the stove yesterday," he said. "Temporarily," she said. "It needs proper work. You know anybody on the ranch with metalworking skill?" "Holloway used to do some smithing before he came to cattle work," Pete said. "He don't talk about it much, but I seen him fix things." "Thank you," she said. He nodded, looked at his coffee. Then, without quite meeting her eyes, "Dale wasn't trying to be, I mean." "He's not." He stopped. "He's all right, usually. He just talks before he thinks." "Most people do," Clara said. Not unkindly. Pete looked relieved in a way that told her he'd been worried about that since yesterday and had been carrying it around like a pebble in his boot. "The beans were real good," he said. "The molasses in them." "I didn't expect that." "Good," she said. "Go drink your coffee." He went and drank his coffee, and Clara turned back to the stove, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence she'd experienced since arriving in Wyoming. The rest of the morning moved fast. She made a proper breakfast, eggs from the 6 hens she'd found behind the barn that apparently nobody had thought to utilize systematically, fried in the cast iron, with some of the salt pork sliced thin and fresh biscuits and the coffee. And the men came in from the bunkhouse and ate without complaint and without commentary, and that itself felt like progress. Gus ate quickly and left early. He caught her eye on the way out and gave a small nod that meant they were on the same page and he hadn't said anything. Nate came in last again, same as yesterday, and ate standing at the counter instead of at the table, which she was starting to understand was just how he operated, always a little apart, always in a posture that said he could leave at any moment. That sitting down and settling in was a commitment he wasn't quite ready to make. He said, "You're going to need to go into town for the supply order." "I know," she said. "I was playing tomorrow if there's a way to arrange transport." "Gus can take you in the wagon," he paused. "What's your list?" She handed him the paper she'd already written out. He looked at it, turned it over, looked at the back. His expression was neutral, but his eyes moved carefully down the list. "This is thorough," he said. "It needs to be," she said. "You're understocked significantly. I want to get you to a proper baseline. This is going to cost less than you think," she said. "And less than the alternative." He looked up from the paper at that. "The alternative," she said carefully, "being that your men continue to work at reduced capacity because they're not being fed properly, and the work suffers, and the cattle suffer, and the ranch falls further behind than it already is." She watched him weigh that. She'd learned in about 36 hours that Nate Brooks responded to practical arguments. Not to appeals, not to emotion, to logic stated plainly without softening. "All right," he said. He handed the list back to her. "Go tomorrow." He left. She folded the list and put it in her apron pocket, and her hand stayed on it for a moment. Tomorrow she would go to town. Tomorrow she would go to the courthouse and look at the county land assessment records. And she would find whatever Victor Hale had buried in there, or she would find nothing, and she would know which thing she was dealing with. Either way, she would know. The road to Harlan's Creek took about 2 hours by wagon, and Gus drove in the particular silence of a man who had things on his mind that he was deciding whether to say. He lasted until they were about 40 minutes out. "I pulled the last 2 years of delivery receipts this morning," he said. "Before anybody was up. And," she said, "it's worse than what we found last night." He kept his eyes on the road. "There's 3 orders in the fall of last year, where the invoice and the delivery slip both say the same number, But I found a note in my own handwriting in the margin of the October ledger that says we came up short on the cornmeal. I wrote it down at the time and then I don't know. I moved on, there was too much else happening. What was happening in October, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Brooks died in September, he said. Nate was. Gus stopped. It was a hard fall. For everybody. Things got missed. She understood what he was saying. The grief had created a window. And somebody had used it. I want to see that October ledger, she said. When we get back. It's on the desk, he said. I left it out. She nodded. They rode for a while without talking. Then Gus said, Victor Hale made his first formal offer on the ranch in November. 6 weeks after Mrs. Brooks passed. Clara said nothing. But something in her jaw tightened. Nate turned him down flat. Hale came back in February with a second offer higher. Nate turned that down too. Gus shifted the reins. Third offer came in May. Still no. But Hale's lawyer sent a letter along with it that talked about the debt load, the operating costs, how the market was shifting, all very polite and he searched for the word informational. Pressured, velvet kind, Gus said. The kind that's hard to point at. And the debt, how much of it is legitimate? That's what I can't figure. Some of it's real. There were 2 bad winters, lost cattle. The kind of losses that happen. But some of it, he shook his head. The numbers don't move the way I'd expect if it was just bad luck. That's why I need the county records, she said. He nodded. They pulled into Harlan's Creek shortly after, and Clara went first to the general and feed store, not Cars, but a smaller competitor on the far side of town that she'd asked Gus about on the road. A man named Abernathy who had a smaller stock but a clean reputation. She placed the supply order there, negotiated a delivery arrangement, and left with a receipt in her pocket and a 3-day delivery window that Abernathy had confirmed without hesitation. Then she walked to the courthouse. The county records were public. That was the thing people like Victor Hale sometimes forgot, or perhaps didn't forget but calculated that most people wouldn't bother with, that all of it was there, available, sitting in ledgers on shelves, if someone had the patience and the arithmetic to go through it. Most people didn't. Most people were busy, or tired, or didn't know what they were looking for. Clara knew what she was looking for. She spent an hour and 40 minutes at the records clerk's counter, going through the land assessment records for the Broken Spur and the surrounding parcels. The clerk, a thin young man who had clearly never had anyone come in and ask to see this particular set of records with this particular focus, kept looking at her like he wasn't sure whether to be helpful or alarmed. And ultimately settled on helpful because she was polite and organized, and clearly not leaving until she'd seen what she'd come to see. What she found took her breath away for just a moment. Just a moment before she got it back and started writing. The land assessments for the Broken Spur had been revised. Twice. Both times in the last 14 months. Both times upward, increasing the assessed value of the land, which increased the property tax burden, which increased the cash flow pressure on a ranch that was already struggling. The revisions were signed off on by the county assessor, a man whose name she wrote down carefully. And the comparable properties used to justify the increased assessments the parcels cited as evidence of the land's increased value were 3 properties that had sold in the past 18 months at inflated prices. Sold to a holding company. A holding company whose registered agent, she found in the corporation records the clerk reluctantly produced when she asked, was a lawyer named Patterson. She knew that name. Patterson was the lawyer who had sent the polite informational letter with Victor Hale's third offer on the Broken Spur. She wrote it all down, every number, every name, every date. She thanked the clerk. She walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps in the Wyoming sun for a moment, feeling the weight of what she was carrying. It wasn't just undershipping. It wasn't just a supplier skimming off the top of delivery orders. It was a coordinated effort, supply starvation, false debt pressure, manipulated land assessments designed to push Nathaniel Brooks to the point where he had no choice but to sell. And the man behind it was patient and careful, and had positioned himself at every angle, the supplier, the county assessor, the holding company inflating comparable values. All of it connected back to Victor Hale, through enough layers that you'd have to be looking specifically to find it. She had been looking specifically. She walked back to where Gus was waiting with the wagon. He took one look at her face and said, "You found something." "I found everything," she said. "Let's go home." She told him on the road back. Not all of it, she was still organizing it in her head, still making sure she understood the connections she'd drawn, but enough. Enough that by the time they were halfway back to the broken spur, Gus had gone very quiet and very still in the way of a man who is recalibrating something fundamental. "The assessor's name," he said finally. "Write it down for me." She showed him the page. He looked at the name. His face did something. "What?" she said. "James Creel," he said. "He's been county assessor for 6 years. His daughter married a man named..." He stopped. "Named what?" "Named Junior. Victor Hale's son." Clara sat with that for a moment. "So Hale's son married the county assessor's daughter," she said. "A year and a half ago," Gus said. "Right around the time the first assessment revision went through." The silence between them had a different quality now. Heavier. "More real, Gus," she said. "I know," he said. "We have to tell Nate too. Tonight," she said. "We can't wait on this. If Hale makes another move before Nate understands the full picture." "I know," Gus said, and his voice had gone rough in a way that made her understand. He was angry genuinely, quietly, deeply angry, not at Clara, but at himself for not seeing it sooner. Clara, I should have..." "Stop," she said. "You were managing a ranch in grief after losing someone you all cared about, and someone with money and patience and connections used that time deliberately. That's on you." Gus looked at the road. "We tell Nate tonight," she said again. He nodded. Nate was in the main house when they got back, at the desk in what served as his office, a room that was part workspace, part repository for everything that had accumulated in 11 years of running a cattle operation, with stacks of papers and ledgers and correspondence that she could see through the half-open door as she walked past. She knocked. "Come in." She came in and Gus came in behind her, and Nate looked at them both, at whatever was on their faces, and sat back in his chair slowly. "Close the door," he said. Gus closed it. Clara sat in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited, because she'd learned in 36 hours that with Nate Brooks you didn't wait to be invited to things. You just did them, and let him decide whether he had a problem with it afterward. She laid her notes on the desk. She walked him through it. The supply records, the delivery discrepancies, the pattern over 18 months. Edwin Carr, the county assessment revisions, James Creel, the holding company, Patterson, Victor Hale. She laid it out plainly, in order, without drama, because she'd also learned that Nate Brooks did not respond well to drama. What he responded to was facts, clean and sequential. She gave him facts. He didn't interrupt. He read the pages she slid toward him as she referenced them. His face was still throughout, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent years making his face a place where other people can't read what's happening. But his hands, resting flat on the desk, she watched those, because the hands are where stillness goes when the face won't show it. And his hands, by the end of what she was telling him, were pressing into the desk with a pressure that was controlled but wasn't nothing. When she finished, there was silence. "Say it again," he said. "The assessor, James Creel," she said. "His daughter is married to Victor Hale's son." The first assessment revision on the broken spur went through 3 months after that wedding. Nate's jaw moved, just once. "And the holding company that bought the comparable properties." "Registered to Patterson's firm," she said. "The same attorney who sent the letter with Hale's third offer." Another silence. "Then how did you find this?" "County records are public," she said. "I asked to see them. The clerk just showed you." I was polite, and I asked specifically. Most people don't ask specifically. He looked at her notes for a long moment. Then he looked up. She met his eyes. "Because it needed doing. That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have," she said. "I know what this looks like. I know what it does to a family when somebody uses money and patience and legal machinery to take what isn't theirs." I'm not going to watch it happen if I can help it. Nate was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "What do you need?" "A lawyer," she said. "Not from this county. Somebody who can look at what I found and tells us whether it's enough to fight with." "There's a man in Cheyenne," Gus said from the corner. Hatcher. "He's honest. I've heard he's honest anyway." "Write to him," Clara said, "tonight. And Mr. Brooks, don't give Hale any indication that you know any of this. Whatever he does next, however he approaches you, you receive it the same way you've been receiving it." Polite refusal, no more, no less. "You're telling me how to handle my own affairs," Nate said. "I'm telling you how to protect them," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her across the desk for a long, considering moment. "All right," he said. "I'll write to Hatcher tonight." She stood, picked up her notes, she was keeping those, and nodded at him once. "Dinner in an hour," she said. She walked out. She heard Nate say, very quietly, "Where did she come from?" And Gus's answer, equally quiet, "Wagon from town." Same as everybody. She made a proper dinner that night. Not because she felt triumphant, she didn't, not yet. There was too much ahead that could still go wrong, but because the men needed to eat, and because the act of making food for people who needed it was the most grounding thing she knew. It settled her. It always had, the rhythm of it. The decisions, small and immediate and solvable. Add this, adjust that. More heat. Trust the thing you know. She made a beef stew with the last of the good cut she'd found in the cold cellar, and cornbread, and the dried apple dessert again, because Pete Duvall had looked at her at breakfast with such transparent hope on his face that she didn't have the heart to disappoint him. The men ate. The table was fuller than it had been in months. She could feel it. Even if she couldn't have explained how, the way a room has a different quality when people in it are not just refueling but actually present. After dinner, Dale Renfrew came into the kitchen while she was cleaning up. She heard him come in and did not turn around. "I owe you an apology," he said. She turned then. He was standing just inside of the door, hat in his hands, turning it by the brim a habit. He was uncomfortable, and didn't want to be in that position. He was 24, and he looked it right now, younger than usual, without the performance of confidence he wore when other men were watching. "Yesterday, what I said. I was out of line." "You were," she said. "I know," he said. He stopped. Started again. She was a big woman. And people weren't kind about it. And I still said what I said, which makes me worse than those people, and I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment, decided. "Apology accepted," she said. "You want some coffee before you go back to the bunkhouse?" He blinked, like he'd expected it to be harder than that. "Yes, ma'am, if it's no trouble." "It's no trouble," she said. He sat at the kitchen table, and she poured him a cup and poured one for herself, and they sat in the kitchen that was finally warm again, with the stove doing its job and the night settling in around the ranch. And he told her a little about his mother, where she was from, what she'd been like, and she listened, and didn't offer anything in return about herself, because some things you keep until you're sure of the ground you're standing on. But it was a beginning. When he left, Nate was standing in the hall. He'd heard it, at least some of it. She could tell by the way he was standing. "He's a good hand when he gets out of his own way," Nate said. Quietly. "Most people are," she said. He looked at her. "I sent the letter to Hatcher," he said. "Good," she said. "If he comes back with something useful, then we use it," she said. "If he doesn't, we figure out another angle." Nate was quiet for a moment. "Then you always like this?" "Like what?" "Certain," he said. She thought about that. "Not always," she said honestly. "But I've learned that in the absence of certainty, you act like you have it, and sometimes it becomes true." He considered that. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Good night, Mr. Brooks," she said. She went back to her room and sat on the bed and opened her mother's recipe book in the dark, not reading it, just holding it. The pages were soft with use, and the handwriting inside was in her mother's careful script, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes holding it was enough. Tomorrow she would keep cooking. Tomorrow she would keep watching. Victor Hale was going to move again. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming, not yet, but building somewhere out past the edge of what you could see. She would be ready. The letter from Hatcher arrived 8 days later. Clara knew it had come before anyone told her, because she heard Nate's boot stop in the hallway outside the kitchen at an odd hour mid-morning, when he was usually out on the land, and then start again, slower than usual, and go into the office and close the door. She knew the particular sound of a door being closed when a man needed to think without being watched. She kept working. She had bread rind, a pot of beans on, and a list of things that needed doing before the midday meal, and she did all of them with the part of her mind that ran on habit and muscle memory, while the other part waited. He came out 40 minutes later. He came to the kitchen door and stood in it, and she turned from the stove and looked at him, and his face was doing the thing it did when the calculation behind it had reached a conclusion he didn't like. Hatcher wrote back, he said. "I know," she said. What did he say? Nate came into the kitchen and set the letter on the table. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and sat down and read it. Hatcher was careful in his language, lawyers always were, but the substance of what he was saying was clear enough. What Clara had found was real. The assessment manipulation was documentable. The connection between the county assessor and Hale's family was a matter of public record that had simply never been assembled in the way Clara had assembled it. The holding company structure was potentially challengeable. He used words like potentially and subject to further review and depending on jurisdiction, but underneath all of that careful lawyerly hedging was a man who had read her notes and was telling them, as plainly as his profession allowed, that they had something. He also said something else in the last paragraph. He says there are 2 other ranches, Nate said. He'd been watching her read. "I see it," she said. "Same pattern." "Same pattern," she said. "Different names on the assessment revisions, but the same assessor, same timing, same holding company purchases driving up the comparables." She set the letter down. "Hale's been running this across multiple properties. The broken spur isn't the only one." Nate pulled out the chair across from her and sat. That alone told her something. Nate Brooks, sitting down in the middle of the morning, was not a thing that happened without weight behind it. "The Connolly place," he said quietly, "and the Morrison homestead. They both sold last fall." I thought he stopped. "I thought they just had enough. Hard years. Decided to move on." "They may have decided that," Clara said, "but I'd want to know what they were told before they decided it. And what their assessment records looked like in the months before the sale." He looked at her. "I want to ride out to the Connolly place," she said. "Or wherever the Kennellys are now. Hatcher will want their testimony if we take this to court, and before we take it to court I want to know whether the pattern holds." "You're talking about building a case," Nate said. "I'm talking about making sure the one we have is strong enough before we bring it in front of anyone official," she said. "Because if we go in with something that has gaps, Hale's lawyer closes those gaps before we can open them again. We get one real shot at this." Nate was quiet. "Then the Kennellys are in town now. Renting rooms above Abernathy's store, last I heard. Bob Connolly's been taking day work wherever he can find it." Clara stood. "Then I need to go to town. We just went to town 4 days ago." "And I need to go again," she said. "I'll make sure the midday is handled before I go. I can ask Pete to keep an eye on the stove. He's more capable than he lets on." Nate looked at her for a long moment. The calculation was running again. She waited. "I'll take you." She looked at him. "Don't read something into it," he said. "I know Bob Connolly. He'll talk to me. He might not talk to you." "That's fair," she said. "Be ready in an hour," he said. He stood, picked up Hatcher's letter, folded it back into its envelope. "And Clara," he said her name for the first time. It came out slightly differently than she expected, like it surprised him a little to use it. "What you found. Most people wouldn't have." She looked at him steadily. Most people weren't looking. He nodded once and walked out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left, listening to the house settle around her. Then she turned back to the stove, because the bread wasn't going to manage itself. Bob Connolly was a man who had been defeated so recently that the shape of it was still fresh on him, the way a bruise is worst in the third day after the blow. He was sitting in a chair in the small room above Abernathy's when Nate brought Clara up to meet him, and he stood when they came in with the automatic courtesy of a man raised to stand for visitors, but the standing cost him something. She could see that. His wife, Margaret, was in the corner, mending something, and she looked up with eyes that had the particular watchfulness of a woman who had learned to read situations fast because situations had been unpredictable lately. "Nate Bob Connolly," she said. He shook Nate's hand. He looked at Clara with a polite question on his face. "This is Clara Whitmore," Nate said. "She's been helping me look into some things. I'd like her to ask you a few questions if you're willing." Bob Connolly looked at Clara, then back at Nate. Something passed between the two men, the shorthand of people who have known each other long enough to skip the middle portion of a conversation. "What kind of things?" Bob said. "The kind," Nate said quietly, "that might explain why you're sitting in a rented room above a feed store instead of on your own land." Bob Connolly sat back down in his chair. His wife's hands went still on her mending. Clara sat across from him and asked him to tell her about the assessment notices. He told her. It came out slowly at first, the way things come out when a man is ashamed of what happened to him, when he's still in the process of deciding whether the shame belongs to him or somewhere else. But it came, the assessment revision, arriving in January of last year. The new tax burden, which on paper was manageable but in practice, stacked on top of 2 bad winters and an operating loan already stretched thin, was the thing that finally put the numbers underwater. The visits from a man representing a buyer he hadn't been told the buyer's name at first, offering to purchase at what seemed like a fair price, given the assessment. The sense that there was no other path. They came 3 times, Margaret Connolly said from the corner. Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge to it, the edge of someone who had been quiet for too long on a subject. Each time the offer was a little higher. Each time they'd bring new paperwork showing us why the situation was worse than we thought. "Who brought the paperwork?" Clara asked. "A lawyer named Patterson," Bob said. Clara kept her face still. "Did you keep any of that paperwork?" she said. Bob and Margaret looked at each other. "We kept everything," Margaret said. I insisted. Bob wanted to just put it behind us. But I said no. I said we were keeping everything. She went to the trunk in the corner and opened it. Inside was a box. And the box was a stack of documents neatly tied with a piece of ribbon. Margaret Connolly, who had known in her bones that something was wrong, and had kept everything anyway, just in case Margaret Connolly, who probably didn't know it, had just handed them the second pillar of a case. Clara looked at the stack of documents and felt something rise in her chest that she kept carefully off her face. "Mrs. Connolly," she said, "would you be willing to let me take these to a lawyer in Cheyenne? His name is Hatcher. He's honest, you'd have them back." Margaret looked at her husband. Bob looked at Nate. "Nate," he said, "is this real? Are you actually fighting this?" "I am," Nate said. "Because I have to tell you, Hale's got people in this county, Bob. He's got the assessor, and that assessor's got friends, and—" "I know," Nate said. "That's why we're going to Cheyenne." Bob Connolly looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked up, the defeat on his face had shifted into something else. Something harder and older and more useful. "Take the papers," he said. "And tell me what else you need." On the ride back to the Broken Spur, Nate drove and Clara held the box of Connolly documents in her lap, both hands resting on top of it, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Nate said the Morrison family. They left the county entirely. Went to Colorado. "We'd need to reach them by letter," Clara said. "I know their son. He's in Cheyenne." He paused. "I'll write to him tonight, along with a letter to Hatcher about the Connolly papers." "Good," she said. "You knew this is what we'd find," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was the statement of a man recalibrating. "I thought it was likely," she said. "When a scheme like this works once, people use it again. It's human nature. Success makes people bold. And the assessor just nobody questioned him. Small irregularities," she said. "That's the whole design. Nothing big enough to make noise. Just small, steady pressure from every direction until the thing you're targeting collapses on its own, and everyone who watches it collapse thinks they're just watching the natural order of things. She paused. It works because it counts on the people it's happening to being too overwhelmed or too ashamed to look closely. And it counts on everyone around them not having the time or the inclination to look closely either. But you looked, he said. I had time, she said. And I know what to look for. He was quiet for a moment. Then you said before it was because of your family. What happened to your family? She looked at the road ahead of them. My father died when I was 12, she said. My mother had a small piece of land. Good land, enough to support us if we worked it. When I was 16, a man started buying up land in our county, not so different from Hale, just smaller in his ambitions. He found a surveyor willing to redraw a boundary line on paper. Nothing you'd notice unless you had the original surveys and the knowledge to compare them. Then he had the county record the new line. Then he had a lawyer send my mother a notice that she was in trespass on a portion of land she'd worked for 10 years. She paused. She didn't know how to fight it. She didn't have money for a lawyer. She didn't know that what was happening to her was illegal and not inevitable. She thought the paperwork meant it was true, because that's what paperwork is supposed to mean. Nate said nothing. We lost about a third of the land, Clara said. Not all of it. Enough that it was harder. Enough that the winters after that were the kind of winters where you count everything. She adjusted the box in her lap. I was 16. I couldn't stop it then. I didn't know enough, and I was a 16-year-old girl, and nobody was going to listen to me. But I learned. After that, I paid attention to every document, every record, every piece of paper that passed through any house I worked in. I learned what to look for because I never wanted to be in that position again of watching something be taken and not knowing how to stop it. The wagon rolled on. About your mother's land. She got through it, Clara said. She was tougher than the loss. She paused. She's gone now, 3 years ago. But she got through it fine. The recipe book, he said. She looked at him. You noticed that. It's on the shelf in the kitchen, he said. I noticed it the first day. It is used, she said. She wrote it over about 20 years. Every recipe she ever worked out, she looked back at the road. It's the most valuable thing I own. He didn't say anything to that. But something in the way he held the reins changed slightly, loosened by a fraction, like a man who has just set down something he'd been carrying without realizing it. They got back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and Clara gave Pete the box of documents to put in the office. She trusted Pete. She'd made that decision days ago and went to start dinner. And the ranch moved around her in its familiar rhythms, and she felt for the first time in a long time that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not examine that feeling too closely. She made dinner. Victor Hale arrived 3 days later. She heard about it from Pete, who came into the kitchen at a dead run and stopped in the doorway breathing hard and said, "There's a carriage coming up the road." Gus says it's Hale. Clara set down her spoon. "Where's Mr. Brooks?" Pete said.
He saw it coming.
"Go back outside," she said. "Don't say anything. Just watch." Pete went. Clara untied her apron, folded it over the back of a chair, and moved to the window that gave a partial view of the yard. Victor Hale was not what she'd imagined, and she'd spent time imagining him. He was older than she'd expected, mid-60s, well-kept in the way of men who have always had money, and therefore have always had access to the things that keep a man looking well-kept. He was not large, he was not loud. He came out of that carriage with a deliberateness that said he understood that his presence was a statement, and that the statement did not need to be shouted. His lawyer Patterson came with him. She recognized the name from the documents and found she could identify the man on sight. There was a type, and he was it, young and smooth, and carrying a leather case with both hands. Nate stood in the yard and waited for them to come to him. He did not move toward the carriage. She watched him do that and felt something she didn't name. Hale extended his hand. Nate shook it briefly. She couldn't hear what was being said from where she stood. She watched the body language instead. Hale speaking. gesturing toward the land in a proprietary way, like a man pointing at something he considers already his. Patterson opening the leather case, Nate standing with his arms at his sides, not crossed, not defensive, just present. Then Nate shook his head. Hale said something else. Nate shook his head again. Patterson offered a paper. Nate looked at it, did not touch it, looked up at Hale. Said something. Hale's face changed, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes, the adjustment of a man recalculating. Then Hale looked toward the house. He looked directly at the window where Clara was standing. She didn't step back. She met his eyes through the glass or the distance. She couldn't be sure he could actually see her clearly. And she held them, and she kept her face still, and she did not look away. Hale said something to Patterson. Patterson looked toward the house too. Then Hale looked back at Nate and said something with a different tone. She could see the change in the angle of his head, the shift to something cooler and more deliberate. Then they got back in the carriage and left. Nate came inside 5 minutes later. He came directly to the kitchen. He offered twice the assessed value, he said. Clara said, "He's worried. That's what I thought." He pulled out a chair and sat. Patterson gave me a paper, a letter. He set it on the table. She picked it up and read it. It was a formal notice of intent to pursue legal action regarding an outstanding lien on the property. A lien she had not seen in any of the records she'd examined. Her stomach tightened. "I didn't find this in the records," she said. 6 weeks ago. He created it after." She stopped. Gus asked around about Hatcher. Somebody talk." "Somebody talk," Nate agreed. His voice was even, but his hands were on the table and the pressure was back. "This lien," she said, reading carefully. "It's attached to an unpaid bill from a supplier. It names Edwin Carr," Nate said. She looked up. "Carr is claiming I owe him for 3 orders that he says were placed and delivered but never paid for," Nate said. "He's filed a lien against the property for the amount." "Did you place those orders?" "No," Nate said flatly. "I did not. Are there records showing you didn't?" "I don't know what records exist. Gus manages the orders." She stood up. "Get Gus." Gus came in from the barn with his sleeves still rolled and his face already set in the expression of a man who had been expecting bad news and was now receiving it. She showed him the lien notice. She watched him read it. "These order dates," he said. "Yes," she said. 2 of them are from months where we'd already shifted the supply order to Abernathy," he said. "I have the Abernathy receipts. Right there in the file box." "Then those 2 we can disprove outright," she said. "What about the 3rd? Gus looked at the date. Something crossed his face. "The 3rd one is from September of last year," he said. "Right after Mrs. Brooks passed." The kitchen went quiet. That was a hard month. "I don't know for certain whether there might have been an order placed directly by someone here that didn't go through my usual record keeping." "Could someone have placed an order in the ranch's name without your knowledge?" Clara said. "During that month, possibly. I wasn't," he stopped again. Tried again. "I wasn't at my best that month. And Nate certainly wasn't." "If someone had come to the ranch with a delivery and said it was ordered, one of the hands might have signed for it without thinking," Nate said, from the corner, in a very quiet voice. "He used that month." Nobody answered, because there was nothing useful to say to that. "The 2 Abernathy orders we can disprove clean," Clara said, and her voice was steady because one of them needed to be steady. "The 3rd one we need to establish whether any delivery came in September, whether anyone signed for anything, and whether Carr has a document with a signature on it. If he has a forged signature, then we deal with that," she said. "One thing at a time. Gus, pull the Abernathy receipts for the 2 dates on that notice. Tonight. Nate, write to Hatcher again tonight and tell him about the lien. Tell him we have documentation to counter 2 of the 3 claims and are investigating the 3rd. And the 3rd," Nate said. "I need to talk to every man on this ranch who was here in September," she said. "Every one of them. Starting tomorrow morning. Someone may have seen something. Signed something, remembered something. That's how we find out." She looked at both of them. "He made a move," she said. That means he's scared. Scared means we're closer than he thought we were. This is not the time to lose our nerve. Gus looked at Nate. Nate looked at Clara. All right, he said. She started with Pete the next morning. He hadn't been at the ranch in September, he'd joined on in November, he told her, so he had nothing for her there. But he sat with her at the kitchen table while she worked through the breakfast prep, and he told her who had been here then. She wrote down names. Holloway had been here. A hand named Curtis who had since moved on, she noted that and made a mental reminder that Curtis would need to be located. 2 other men currently on the ranch. She talked to all of them, through the course of that morning and the early afternoon, fitting the conversations into the spaces between meals the way she fit everything efficiently, without waste, using what she had. The first 2 gave her nothing useful. They'd been in the field most of September, they said, and wouldn't have been near the supply entrance. Holloway was different. She found him at the water trough in the mid-afternoon and said, "I need 5 minutes." He looked at her from under the brim of his hat. "Figured you'd get to me eventually." "September," she said, "late September. Was there a delivery to the ranch that came through when Gus wasn't around?" Holloway was quiet for a long time. "There was a man came by," he said. "With a wagon. Said he was from Cars. Said it was an order the boss had placed. He stopped. I told him I didn't know about any order. He showed me a paper. Said it had the ranch's name on it. I couldn't. He stopped again. It was 3 days after we buried Mrs. Brooks. I didn't want to bother Nate with it. I signed for the delivery just to get the man to leave." "What did he deliver?" "Sacks," Holloway said. "Flour, I think, maybe cornmeal. I put them in the pantry. I figured someone had ordered them and forgotten to tell Gus." "Holloway," she said carefully, "did the sack go into the kitchen?" He thought. "I thought they did. I put them in the pantry." "I never saw them," she said. "I went through that pantry my first day here. I inventoried everything. There were no extra sacks that didn't match Gus's records." He stared at her. "He staged a delivery," she said. "Brought sacks to your door, got your signature, took the sacks away again, and now he has a signed receipt for a delivery that never actually stayed." Holloway's face went through several things in quick succession. At the end of all of them, what was left was something very hard and very cold. "I signed it," he said. "You signed it in grief, 3 days after a funeral, when a man showed up with official-looking papers," she said. "That is not the same as doing something wrong." He looked at his hands. "Holloway," she said, "I need you to write down everything you just told me. Exactly as you told me. Date and time and what he looked like and what he said and what you signed." "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Tonight," he said. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She turned back. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have been sharper." "You were grieving," she said. "You did the best you could. Now you're going to help fix it. That's enough." She walked back to the kitchen. Inside, she stood for a moment with her hands on the counter and let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying, because she allowed herself that not the display of it, but the acknowledgement. She was one woman with a ledger and a recipe book, and a set of skills that most people had decided didn't count for much. And she was standing between a man who had built something real, over 11 years, and another man with money and connections, and a lawyer and a willingness to use grief as a weapon. She felt the weight. Then she picked up her spoon and started on dinner, because the men needed to eat, because the bread wouldn't make itself, and because she had never once in her life solved a problem by stopping in the middle of it. She had Holloway's testimony. She had the Abernathy receipts. She had the Connolly documents. She had Hatcher in Cheyenne and a letter on its way to the Morrison Sun in Colorado. What she needed now was time. She prayed she had enough of it. Hatcher arrived on a Tuesday. Clara knew he was coming because Nate had gotten a second letter 4 days prior, saying the lawyer would make the trip from Cheyenne personally, which told her something about how seriously Hatcher was taking what they'd sent him. Lawyers who weren't interested didn't make 14-mile wagon rides from the nearest town. Lawyers who saw something real did. She had breakfast on the table when the wagon pulled into the yard, and she had a pot of coffee ready, and she had, without quite planning it, made the kind of meal that said this house is functioning, and this household has its footing, because she understood that first impressions were made out of everything in the room, and not just the words spoken in it. Hatcher was a compact man in his mid-50s, with a neat gray beard and the eyes of someone who had spent 30 years reading documents and people with equal attention. He shook Nate's hand. He shook Gus's hand. He looked at Clara when Nate introduced her and said, "You're the one who found the assessment records." "I am," she said. "You have a sharp mind for this kind of work," he said. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation, the way a man takes stock of a tool before deciding how to use it. "Eat something. Then we can talk." He sat. He ate. He was the kind of man who understood that eating when food was offered was practical and not a social performance, and he finished his plate quickly and efficiently and accepted a second cup of coffee. And then he opened his case on the kitchen table while the men were still finishing and said, "All right. Let me tell you where we are." Where they were was better than Clara had let herself hope, and worse in one specific way she hadn't anticipated. The good Hatcher had taken the Connolly documents to a colleague who specialized in property law, and between the two of them they had confirmed what Clara had found. The assessment manipulation was real. The connection to Hale was traceable. He had also received a letter back from the Morrison son in Cheyenne, who had confirmed that the same pattern had been applied to his family's land, and who had his own documents. His mother, like Margaret Connolly, had been the kind of woman who kept everything that showed the same assessor, the same holding company, the same lawyer. 3 ranches, 3 families, 1 coordinated scheme. "That's enough to take to court," Hatcher said. "In my professional opinion, it is enough. Whether the court agrees is never a certainty, but the evidence is substantive and the pattern is clear." "The lien," Nate said. "That's the complication," Hatcher said. He pulled a paper from his case. "The 2 orders tied to Abernathy's period, you have clean receipts that disprove those outright. Carr's claim falls apart on those 2. But the September order, the one with Holloway's signature," he set the paper down. "Carr's lawyer is going to argue that the signature constitutes proof of delivery and proof of the debt." "The delivery didn't stay," Clara said. "Holloway signed for sacks that were taken back off the property." "You can prove the sacks didn't stay?" "I can prove that the pantry inventory I took on my first, which I documented on paper, which Gus countersigned, shows no surplus consistent with a delivery of that size during that period." Hatcher looked at her steadily. "You documented your pantry inventory." "I document everything," she said. He looked at Nate. "You hired this woman to cook," Nate said. Hatcher looked back at Clara with that evaluating expression. Then he said, "The inventory documentation helps. It doesn't close the gap entirely, because there's an argument that supplies could have been used in the period between delivery and your arrival. But combined with Holloway's sworn statement about the nature of the delivery," he paused, "I think we can create enough reasonable doubt about the lien's legitimacy to have it challenged. It won't be clean, but it's workable." "What do we do first?" Clara said. "First," Hatcher said, "I file a formal challenge to the lien on your behalf. That buys time and puts Carr on the defensive. He'll have to produce his documentation, which I suspect is thinner than his lawyer is currently representing. Second, I submit the assessment evidence to the state land office in Cheyenne. What Creel did exceeds his authority as county assessor and violates state property law. That's a separate complaint from your lawsuit, but it strengthens the overall picture." "And Hale?" Nate said. "Hale is careful," Hatcher said. "Everything runs through people he controls but isn't directly attached to. Creel, the holding company. He keeps his own name off the documents. Can we get to him?" "If we can get one of his people to talk," Hatcher said carefully, "yes. Patterson is the most likely candidate. He's a young lawyer who may not have fully understood what he was getting into, and when he sees the scope of what we're prepared to present, he may decide that protecting Victor Hale is not worth the cost to his own license." Clara said, "When do we go to court?" "That depends on how quickly Carr's lawyer responds to the lien challenge. Could be 6 weeks, could be 3 months. 3 months, Nate said quietly. He wasn't complaining, he was calculating. I know, Hatcher said. The ranch needs to stay operational through that period. Which means financially. We manage, Gus said. It was the first thing he'd said since the meeting started, and it came out with a flatness that meant it was a decision, not a statement of hope. Hatcher nodded. He began gathering his papers. I'll need sworn statements from Holloway, from the Connollys, and from Morrison's son. I'll need the original supply records and the Abernathy receipts. I'll need your pantry inventory, Miss Whitmore, countersigned and dated. You'll have all of it within the week, she said. Then we proceed. He snapped his case shut. Mr. Brooks, I want to be direct with you. This is winnable. The evidence is real and the pattern is damning. But Hale has resources and he has time, and he is going to come at you between now and the court date in ways we can't predict. You need to be prepared for that. Nate said, I've been prepared for it since September of last year. I just didn't know what I was preparing for. Hatcher stood, and there was something in his face that might have been briefly admiration. He shook Nate's hand again. He shook Gus's. He turned to Clara and shook hers too, which was not something men like Hatcher automatically did with women they'd just met, and she understood it as the professional acknowledgement it was. Miss Whitmore, he said, if you ever decide you'd like to do something other than cooking, I could use someone with your eye for documents. I'll keep it in mind, she said. She walked him out to his wagon and stood in the yard as he drove away, and then she went back inside and began washing the breakfast dishes, because that was the next thing that needed doing. The weeks that followed were the longest of Clara's time at the Broken Spur. And they were long in the particular way of periods where the waiting is the work, where the thing you need to do is hold steady and keep going, and not give anyone watching from the outside any indication that the pressure is reaching you. Even when the pressure is real and present and has a face and a name. Hale's next move came 11 days after Hatcher's visit. It didn't come from Hale directly. It came from a man named Gerald Foote who showed up in Harlan's Creek and started talking. He went to the saloon and the barber shop and the feed store and wherever men gathered and exchanged information, and what he said, in the casual way of a man just making conversation, was that he'd heard the Broken Spur was in serious legal trouble. That there was a lien filed against the property. That there were questions about the reliability of the management. That it was a shame, really, when a good operation went sideways. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't demand anything. He just talked. Clara found out about it from Abernathy, who told Gus, who told her, 3 days after Foote had arrived and begun his work. She was rolling biscuit dough when Gus came in and told her, and she kept rolling while she listened, and when he finished she said, he's trying to dry up credit and goodwill before the court date. If the county thinks the ranch is going under, suppliers stop extending terms, neighboring ranchers stop cooperative arrangements. Any informal support network starts to pull back. That's what I figured, Gus said. Can you get a message to Abernathy directly? Not through anyone else directly. I can ride in tomorrow. Tell him the truth, she said. Tell him there's a legal challenge filed, and it's being handled by a Cheyenne lawyer, and the ranch is operational and in good standing. Tell him what Foote is doing and why. Abernathy's an honest man. He'll know what to do with honest information. And the others in town? She pressed the biscuit cutter into the dough. Nate needs to be visible. Not defensive visible. He should go into town himself. Not to explain himself or argue with anyone. Just to be present. To be the man he is. People trust what they can see. Gus nodded. Gus told him that night. Nate went into Harlan's Creek the next day, and he came back that evening looking like a man who had done something that had cost him something, but had been worth the cost. He came into the kitchen while she was finishing dinner and said, Abernathy told me about your message. Good, she said. He said he'd been wondering about the rumors himself. Said hearing it straight changed things. People want to believe the good version, she said. They just need the information to support it. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him pull out a chair. Bob Connolly was in town, he said. He told 2 men at the barber shop what happened to his family. In detail. Unprompted, another pause. He said he decided it was time to stop being ashamed of something that wasn't his fault. Clara set the spoon down for a moment. Just a moment. Then good for him, she said. That'll matter more than anything we could have arranged. It's already spreading, Nate said. The other version. The real version. It usually does, she said, if someone tells it clearly enough. She heard him sit back in the chair, the particular sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding. Clara, he said. She waited. I want you to know that what you've done for this ranch. What you've been doing since the first week. He stopped. Started again. I'm not a man who says things like this easily. I know, she said. So you'll understand it cost me something to say it. I do. A pause, thank you, he said, for all of it. She kept her face to the stove. Don't thank me yet, she said. Wait until after the court date. She heard the sound that was almost not quite a laugh. She hadn't heard that sound from him before. It was brief and low, and she felt it somewhere behind her sternum. All right, he said. After the court date. The second move Hale made was faster and less subtle, and it came at 3 a.m. on a Thursday in late October. Clara woke to the smell. She was up and out of her room and down the hall before she was fully conscious, the way you move when something primitive in you has already identified danger before your thinking mind has caught up. She pushed through the back door and into the yard, and the bunkhouse was on fire. Not the ranch. Not the main house. The bunkhouse. The men were already out. She could hear them, hear the shouting, see the shapes of them moving against the light. She didn't go toward the fire. She to the water pump and started filling buckets, because the first instinct in a fire is always to go toward it, and the useful thing is always the water. And she pumped and passed until her arms were shaking, and the men around her had formed a line and were working it, the way men who have lived on the land know how to work a bucket line, efficiently and without panic. It took 2 hours. The bunkhouse didn't burn to the ground. One end was gone, the corner where the wood was oldest, where it had caught and held but the structure stood. The men's belongings, for the most part, were intact, because the far end had held and the fire had gone up instead of out. When it was over, everyone stood in the yard in the gray pre-dawn and looked at each other. Nate was the one who said it. This wasn't an accident, he said. Quietly, to no one in particular and everyone at once. Nobody argued with him. Clara said, was anyone hurt? A checking of the group. Pete had a burn on his forearm from getting too close. Holloway had breathed enough smoke that he was coughing steadily. Everyone else was intact. Pete, let me see that arm, she said. He held it out. She assessed it in the firelight, 2nd degree, on a patch about the size of her palm, painful but manageable. She went inside and got what she needed, and came back and dressed it there in the yard while the men stood around and the sky began to go gray with early morning. We should report it to the sheriff, Gus said. We should, Nate said. And we should send word to Hatcher today. I'll write the letter, Clara said. She was still wrapping Pete's arm. While you ride to town. Gus looked at Nate. You think the sheriff will do anything? I think the sheriff will write a report, Nate said. Whether he does anything depends on whether what's in that report embarrasses anyone. And right now, he paused. Right now there are enough people in this county who know the real story that a report about arson at the Broken Spur is going to land differently than it would have 2 months ago. Clara tied off the bandage. Pete, she said, you keep this clean and you come to me if it starts to look wrong. Understood? Yes, ma'am, Pete said. He looked down at the wrapped arm, then up at her. His face was young in that gray light, younger than usual, and she could see that the fire had frightened him in a way that the other events of the past weeks hadn't. Because it was fire, because it was physical. Because it put the fear in your body instead of just your mind. You did well tonight, she said. All of you did. Nobody said anything to that, but she's shoulders straightened slightly, here and there, the way they do when people are told something true that they needed to hear. Nate caught her eye over the group. She nodded once. He nodded back. Hatcher's response to the arson's letter arrived 6 days later, and it was 2 pages long, which was the longest thing she'd received from him yet. He had filed the lien challenge. Carr's lawyer had responded, and the response was, in Hatcher's careful language, thinner than expected, which she understood to mean that Carr's documentation didn't hold up as well as Hale had presumably been counting on. The State Land Office had acknowledged receipt of the assessment complaint and had opened a preliminary review, which meant the matter was now in front of people above the county level and outside Hale's circle of influence. And Hatcher had made a quiet approach to Patterson. She read that paragraph 3 times. Patterson had not agreed to talk yet. But he had not refused. He had asked for 2 weeks to consider his position, which Hatcher read, and Clara agreed as a man calculating the relative risks of loyalty and exposure and finding the calculation less comfortable than he'd expected. He's going to flip, Gus said, reading over her shoulder. Patterson's going to flip, maybe Clara said. Don't count it until it's done. But if he does, we have Hale directly, she said, not just the people around him. Hale himself. Gus made a sound that was half satisfaction and half something more complicated. Nate read the letter in the office with the door open. Clara could hear the silence of him reading it, which had a different quality than regular silence. When he came out, he went past the kitchen door and then stopped and came back. The court date, he said. Hatcher says he's targeting 6 weeks from now. 6 weeks. We've held this long, she said. 6 weeks is manageable. He looked at her. Are you worried? She considered the question honestly, because that was what he deserved. I'm concerned about Patterson, she said. If he doesn't flip, our case is still solid. But it's solid against Carr and Creel, not against Hale. And Hale, with Carr and Creel taken down and himself still standing, is a Hale who learns something and adjusts and tries again in 2 years with more care. Nate was quiet. We need Patterson, she said. Or we need Hale himself to do something that puts his name on it directly. He already might have, Nate said. The fire. The fire proves someone committed arson, she said. It doesn't prove who ordered it. He nodded slowly. 6, she said again. We keep the ranch running. We keep the men together. We don't show Hale anything that looks like damage. And if he makes another move before the court date, then we deal with it, she said, same as we've dealt with everything else. He looked at her for a moment with that measuring, recalibrating look that she'd come to understand, was the way Nate Brooks showed something he couldn't quite say directly. I don't know what this ranch would look like right now if you hadn't come, he said. She met his eyes. I think you'd have figured something out. But not this. Not fast enough. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove, because if she kept looking at him for another 5 seconds, something in her face was going to show that she was not ready to have visible. Dinner in an hour, she said. She heard him go. Patterson came to Hatcher's office in Cheyenne on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks before the court date. And Hatcher wrote to tell them what happened with a speed that suggested he'd put the letter in the post before Patterson's wagon was out of sight. Patterson had talked. Not everything, there were limits to what he'd known, which itself was informative, because it told them that Hale kept each of his pieces separate. Knowing one piece didn't mean knowing the whole design. But Patterson had known enough. He confirmed that Hale had directed him to approach the Connellys, the Morrisons, and the Broken Spur. He confirmed that the offers had been made in coordination with the assessment revisions. He confirmed that he had delivered the third offer letters, knowing the comparables used to justify the assessments had been artificially inflated by holding company purchases his own firm had quietly facilitated. He had signed a sworn statement. Clara read Hatcher's letter standing at the kitchen counter, and when she reached the end of it, she set it down and stood very still for a moment. Then she picked it up and read it again. Then she went and found Nate. He was in the barn. She walked in and held out the letter. He took it. He read it. She watched his face. He read it twice, same as she had. Then he looked up. It's enough, she said. It's enough to put Hale in that courtroom directly. Not just Carr and Creel, Hale. Nate's jaw tightened one. Then released. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she said. He looked at the letter again, folded it, held it. My wife, he said quietly. He didn't look at her. She was someone who believed that things worked out right in the end if you were willing to wait long enough and hold on hard enough. He paused. I stopped believing that after she died. Felt like foolish optimism. Like something people told themselves, because the alternative was unbearable. Clara was very still. I think maybe, he said slowly, carefully. She was right. Just about the timeline, she didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to what a man says in a quiet moment in a barn is nothing, just presence, just staying there while he hears himself say it. After a moment he looked at her. Thank you, he said. Again, I know you told me to wait. I said wait until after the court date, she said. He almost smiled. Noted. She turned to go. Clary said. She stopped. When this is over, he said. And then he stopped. Started again. When this is over, I'd like to have a conversation with you. A different kind. Not about court dates or supply records or... I know, she said. I'd like that too. She left him in the barn and walked back to the house and went directly to the kitchen and put her hands on the counter and looked at the stove that she had fixed with clay and patience. That was working now the way it was always supposed to work. And she took one breath and then she started on dinner. 3 weeks. The court date was in Harlan's Creek, in the county courthouse, which under the circumstances was not ideal. Creel was still the county assessor. Though the state review had flagged his conduct and he was operating under scrutiny, but Hatcher said the venue mattered less than the evidence, and the evidence was substantial. Clara went. She hadn't planned to. Initially, she'd planned to stay at the ranch, keep the kitchen running, be there when the men came back. But Nate had come to her 2 days before and said, simply, I want you there, and she had not argued with that. She sat in the back of the courtroom with Gus on one side of her and Pete Duval on the other, and Pete was nervous enough that she could feel it coming off him like heat, and she put her hand briefly on his arm and felt him steady slightly. Bob Connolly was there, and Margaret in her good dress. The Morrison son had come down from Cheyenne. Holloway was there in his best shirt, sitting in the second row with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who intended to testify clearly and did not plan to be nervous about it. Hatcher was at the front table with Nate, and Patterson was there, not as a lawyer but as a witness, looking like a man who had made his peace with the particular kind of discomfort that comes from doing the right thing too late, and knowing it. Victor Hale was there. He had his own lawyer, a man from Denver, expensive, controlled, and he sat with the particular stillness of a powerful man who was accustomed to winning and had not yet been informed that today was different. He looked at Clara once, across the room, the way he had looked at her through the window of the broken spur on the day he came with his velvet pressure and his leather case. She looked back at him. She didn't look away. The proceedings took most of the day. Hatcher presented the evidence in the order Clara would have chosen herself, methodical building, each piece connecting to the next, the way a well-constructed argument is supposed to connect. The assessment records, the Connolly documents, the Morrison documents. Holloway's testimony about the September delivery, which he gave in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the room. The Abernathy receipts. Clara's countersigned pantry inventory, which Hatcher submitted and the opposing lawyer challenged, and the judge looked at carefully and said, in a voice that indicated he found the challenge unpersuasive, the document appears regular. Objection overruled. And then Patterson. Patterson took the stand and said what he'd said in Hatcher's office, and this time he said it in a courtroom under oath, and this time Victor Hale had to sit there and hear his own design described from the inside, piece by the man who had helped build it. Hale's lawyer objected frequently. The judge sustained some. Overruled more. By mid-afternoon, the shape of the decision was apparent in the room the way weather is apparent before it arrives, in the quality of the air, in the angle of things. The judge took a recess, came back, read from his written finding. The lien was invalidated. The assessment revisions were referred to the State Land Office with a recommendation for formal investigation of James Creel's conduct. Hale's claims against the broken spur were dismissed in full. Patterson's sworn testimony was entered into the record for the State Attorney General's review of Hale's broader operations. He did not say Hale was finished. Judges were careful men. But the record said what it said, and what it said was that Victor Hale had used fraud and coordination and patient, deliberate pressure to attempt to take land that was not his, and 3 families had the documentation to prove it. The room was very quiet for a moment after the judge finished. Then Bob Connolly said, in a voice that was not loud but that carried Lord Almighty. And Pete Duvall made a sound somewhere between a breath and a sob and turned it into a cough, and Clara put her hand on his arm again, and this time it was steadier. Nate turned in his seat and found her across the room. She had wondered what his face would do in that moment, when the thing they'd been fighting for finally arrived. She'd imagined controlled relief, measured satisfaction, the contained response of a man who kept his interior life carefully guarded. What she got instead was simpler than that, and it went through her like a current. He looked at her the way a man looks when he sees something he had stopped letting himself want, and he finds it unexpectedly present and real, and no longer theoretical. She held that look for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands in her lap. Outside in the square in front of the courthouse, there was the contained commotion of people who have held themselves together through a long tension and are now carefully releasing it. Gus shook Hatcher's hand. Holloway stood with his hat and didn't say anything to anyone, but looked like a man whose internal accounting had come out right. Bob Connolly and Margaret held on to each other in the particular way of a couple who has survived something and know they have survived it. Pete was talking too fast to anyone who would listen, and Clara let him, because he was 19 and he'd been part of something real and he deserved to feel that completely. Nate came and stood beside her. They stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "You ready to go home?" She looked at him. The word home sat in the space between them for a second, doing something she didn't examine directly but felt clearly. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." They walked to the wagon. He helped her up his hand under her elbow, brief and practical, and she was aware of the help as she was aware of everything, fully, without performing any response to it, just receiving it and moving forward. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon rolled out of Harlan's Creek and onto the road to the Brogan's Spur, and the Wyoming sky was the particular shade it went in the late afternoon of a fall day. And Clara sat beside Nate Brooks and felt the road under the wheels and the air on her face, and something in her chest that had been pulled tight for months beginning, very slowly, to ease. "That conversation," Nate said after a while. "The one I mentioned." "In the barn." "I remember," she said. "I'd like to have it tonight," he said. "If that's all right." She looked at the road ahead of them. "That's all right," she said. He nodded. They rode on. Behind them, Harlan's Creek grew smaller. Ahead of them, the Broken Spur sat on its land. That was going to remain its land, and smoke was starting to come from the chimney of the main house because Holloway had ridden ahead and started the kitchen stove so it would be warm when they arrived. Clara saw the smoke and felt something that she recognized after a moment as exactly what it was. She felt like she was coming home. The kitchen was warm when they got back. Holloway had done more than start the stove. He'd put a pot something on, something simple that smelled like broth and onion, and he'd left a cloth over the bread Clara had set to rise that morning before they left for the courthouse. It had risen properly, which meant the day had been exactly long enough for it, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at all of it and felt the particular gratitude of someone who has been looked after without asking. She went in and finished the bread. She moved around the kitchen the way she always moved in it now, without thinking about the layout, without calculating which shelf held what, without the small constant adjustments of a person in an unfamiliar space. She moved through it the way you move through a place that has become yours, not by deed or declaration, but by the slower, more reliable process of showing up in it every day and caring for it, and being cared for in return. The men came in for dinner in ones and twos. They were quieter than usual, not the quiet of men who are unhappy, but the quiet of men who have been through something together and are still sitting inside it, not quite ready to let it become just a story yet. Pete ate 3 helpings and didn't say much, which for Pete was extraordinary. Holloway sat at the end of the table and looked at his plate and then looked at Clara once, a look that said everything he wasn't going to put into words. And she gave him a small nod, and he looked back at his plate, and that was sufficient for both of them.
Gus said,
Halfway through the meal, Hatcher thinks the state attorney general will move on Hale within the year. Based on the record, nobody responded immediately. Then Dale Renfrew said good, and went back to eating, and that was the full extent of the celebration, and it was enough. After dinner, after the dishes, after the kitchen was set right, and the bread was wrapped and the stove banked for the night, Clara untied her apron and hung it on its hook and went out to the porch. The night was cold. Wyoming in late fall had a cold that was serious and meant it, the kind that came down out of the mountains with no apology. She stood on the porch and felt it on her face and didn't go back in for her shawl because the cold was real and she wanted something real right now, something with an edge to it, to match the way she felt. She heard the door behind her. Nate came and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold air. He didn't say anything immediately. Neither did she. Then he said, "I've been thinking about how to start this conversation since the barn." And she said, "I still don't know," he said. "That's not something that happens to me often. Usually I know what I mean to say." "Then say the part you know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't," he started. Started again. "After Ruth died, I closed something down. Deliberately. Because leaving it open felt like the alternative, and the alternative was..." He stopped again. "Unbearable," she said quietly. "Yes," he looked at the yard. "And it worked for a while. Closing it down, it made things manageable. You lose the warmth of it, but you also lose the other thing, and the trade felt right at the time. And then," she said, "and then a woman showed up in my kitchen with a bag of flour and a broken stove and told me within 24 hours of arriving exactly what was wrong with my supply records and exactly what I needed to do about it." He paused. "And something started to feel like it wasn't right anymore." The trade. Clara kept her eyes on the yard. "I'm not the same as what you lost," she said. Carefully, because this needed to be said plainly. "I don't want you to look at me and see a replacement for something. I'm not that. I can't be." "I know," he said, and the way he said it told her he'd been aware of this himself, that he'd turned it over already. "You're not like Ruth. You're not like anyone you're specific, Clara. You're entirely your own thing. That's not a problem. That's actually the point." She looked at him then. His face in the dark was what it always was, contained, unreadable to most people. But she'd had months of watching it, months of learning the small tells that moved across it when the calculation behind it was working on something that mattered, and she could see now that this was costing him. The openness of it, and that he was paying the cost anyway. "I know what I look like," she said, because this also needed to be said plainly. "I know what men decide about me before they know anything else. I've lived with that my whole life, and I've built something that doesn't need their approval. But I'm telling you now, so it's on the table, I will not be with someone who is settling. I'm not a convenient answer to a problem. I'm not a warm body and a good meal and someone to manage the household. If that's what you're looking for, you should say so now." "That's not what I'm looking for," he said. "Then what are you looking for?" He turned to face her fully. "You," he said specifically. "The woman who fixed my stove and argued with Gus about flour and sat up until midnight with supply records and looked Victor Hale in the eye through my kitchen window and didn't blink." He paused. "The woman who told Bob Connolly's wife that she did the right thing keeping those documents. The woman who dressed Pete's burn in the yard at 3 a.m. and told him he did well. The woman who kept this ranch from going under not because it was her job, but because she decided it mattered and then she made it matter." He paused again. "That's who I'm looking for. I'm not looking for someone easy. I'm looking for you." Clara stood very still. She'd spent 31 years building the part of herself that didn't need this, the part that was self-sufficient and capable, and didn't require anyone's recognition to function. She'd built it well. It was real, and it was hers, and she was proud of it. But there was another part, quieter and older, that had been waiting a long time to be seen like this. Not rescued, not managed, not condescended to or overlooked or reduced. Seen entirely and told that the entirety was the point. she felt that part of herself rise up slowly, like bread with good heat under it. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right?" "All right," she said again. "But I keep the kitchen." Something moved across his face that was, unmistakably, a smile. A real one. She had not seen that before, not the almost version, not the controlled thing he managed sometimes, but the real one. And it changed the whole architecture of his face, and she understood suddenly what he must have looked like before grief got to him, and she felt something sharp and sweet move through her chest. "The kitchen is yours," he said, "and I'll tell you when the supply records are wrong. You already do. And I'll tell you when you're being stubborn. Gus already does that. Gus is polite about it," she said. "I won't be," said. "I don't need polite. I need honest." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the yard, and he looked at the yard too, and they stood there on the cold porch with the Wyoming night around them, and the kitchen warm behind them, and the ranch, his ranch, their ranch, the ranch that was still standing because they had held it settling into the night the way a living thing settles into rest. After a while he reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony. Just the simple, practical gesture of a man who has decided on something and is following through. His hand was calloused and warm and large, and it folded around hers with a confidence that said this was the right decision, and he'd already made it, and he was done deliberating. She left her hand where it was. They stood there a while longer, until the cold made the argument that they should go inside, and they went. The winter came hard that year, the way Wyoming winters came with conviction and duration, and the broken spur went through it the way it had always gone through hard winters. Which was to say, with grit and complaint in equal measure, and the constant management of problems that cold creates for cattle and fences and pipes and men kept too long indoors. Clara kept the kitchen running. She kept the stove hot, and the bread coming, and the meals regular and nourishing, and the men went out in the cold and came back in, and ate and went out again, and the rhythm of it was the rhythm of a working ranch that has found its footing. The rhythm of something that intends to continue. Nate had the bunkhouse properly repaired before the worst of the winter hit, which Clara had suggested in October with the direct practicality she'd established as her primary mode of communication, and he'd done it without argument. The new wood made the structure tighter than it had been before the fire, which Pete pointed out one evening with the particular satisfaction of a young man finding an unexpected silver lining, and Clara had agreed. And Holloway had said something dry about preferring to have found out some other way, and the table had laughed, and that laughing table was the thing that told her, more than any legal proceeding or resolved crisis, that the ranch was going to be all right. Dale Renfrew came into the kitchen on a Saturdays in December and stood in the doorway and said, "Miss Whitmore, I was wondering, my mother used to make a pie, apple and molasses. I don't remember the details of it. If I described what I remember, do you think you could?" "Sit down," Clara said. "Tell me what you remember." He sat down and described it, haltingly, in the imprecise language of childhood memory, where the exact measurements are gone, but the flavor and the feeling are intact, and she asked questions and made notes on the back of a page she pulled from her pocket, and by the end of the conversation, she had enough to work with. She made the pie on Sunday. She set it on the table at dinner, and Dale looked at it and then looked at her and said nothing, but his jaw moved once in a way she recognized, and she turned back to the stove and gave him a moment to collect himself. Later, when only the two of them were in the kitchen and she was washing the pie tin, he said that was it. That was exactly it. "She'd have liked you," he said. "My mother." She turned and looked at him. "I'd have liked her too," she said. He nodded and went to the bunkhouse, and Clara finished washing the tin and put it away on the shelf where it lived, and she held on to that exchange quietly, held it the way she held the things that mattered, not tightly, not with display, just present and careful and close. In January, a letter arrived from the State Attorney General's office. Victor Hale had been formally charged. The charges were significant fraud, conspiracy, misuse of public office by proxy, 3 counts of property theft by deception. The State Land Office had concluded its review of James Creel and had removed him as county assessor pending the outcome of his own legal proceedings. Edwin Carr's business license was under review. Patterson had been placed on probationary status by the Bar Association, which Hatcher's accompanying letter noted was likely the beginning of a longer process. Clara read the state letter and then read Hatcher's letter, and then set both of them on the kitchen table and went and found Nate. He was in the office, where he spent winter mornings working on the accounts properly now. With Gus's help and a new supplier arrangement with Abernathy that was straightforward and honest, and didn't require anyone to count sacks to make sure they'd been shorted. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. She held out the letters. He read them. She watched his face while he read, the way she always watched his face, not intrusively, just attentively, because his face was interesting to her, and she'd stop pretending otherwise. When he finished, he set the letters down on the desk and looked at them for a moment. "It's done," he said. "Most of it," she said. "The legal proceedings will take time. But Hale isn't going to come back from this." "No," he said. "He isn't." He was quiet for another moment. Then he stood up, which put him close to her in the doorway, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to maintain his face in her sightline. "Their land was sold." "I know," she said. "Hatcher said the sale is being challenged as part of the fraud case, but it'll take time." "Gus and I were talking," he said. "If the challenge doesn't restore the property, or even while it's in process, there's a parcel here on the north edge of the broken spur land that's more than we need. We've been under-leveraging it for years." He paused. "Connolly is a good cattleman. He knows land. If we were to bring him on in some arrangement—" "Don't propose it to him as charity," Clara said immediately. "I wasn't going to," he said. "Make it a genuine partnership. Real terms. Something he can build from, not just something to tide him over." "I know how to make a fair offer, Clara." "I know you do," she said. "I just wanted to say it." He looked at her with that almost smile. "You always want to say it, and you always need to hear it." "From you," he said. She held his gaze. "From me," she agreed. He reached up and touched her face just briefly, just his thumb along her cheekbone. The gesture of a man who has learned to say things with his hands, because words have always been the harder language for him, and she let it happen and felt it fully, without deflecting or diminishing. Because she had decided some time ago that this was something she was going to let herself have. He dropped his hand. "I have a question to ask you," he said. "And I'm going to ask it plainly because I don't know how to dress it up, and I don't think you'd want me to." She waited. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook. Not as the woman who fixed what was broken and can move on to somewhere else now that the fixing's done. I want you to stay as mine, as the person this ranch and this house belong to alongside me. As the woman I eat breakfast with and argue with, and who tells me when I'm being stubborn, and who makes apple molasses pie for a homesick cowhand on a Sunday because she understands that food is how you tell people they matter." He paused. "I want to marry you, Clara, if you're willing." The kitchen was quiet beyond the door. The ranch was quiet around the house. The winter was quiet outside, the particular dense quiet of a cold day with no wind. The kind of quiet that holds everything still and makes the world feel very clear. Clara looked at Nathaniel Brooks, at the man who had handed her a supply list and told her to handle it, who had sat across from her at a kitchen table at midnight going through ledgers, who had stood beside her on a cold porch and taken her hand with the simple conviction of someone who had made a decision and was not going back on it, who had looked at her across a courtroom and shown her everything his face usually hid, and she felt the full weight of what he was asking, and she felt the full scope of what she was. And she understood that both of those things were real and sufficient and not in conflict. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment like he was making sure he'd heard it right. "Yes," she said again. "Stop looking at me like that." "I'm not going to apologize for looking," he said. "Fair enough," she said. He smiled again, the real one, the one that changed his whole face, and she felt it again, that sharp, sweet current, and she decided she was done being careful about feeling it. They married in April, when the ground had gone soft again, and the first things were coming up, and the broken spur was moving into the season of work with the confidence of a ranch that had made it through and knew now that it could. Hatcher came, Abernathy came. The Connellys came, Bob and Margaret, who were in the process of settling the North Parcel arrangement with Nate, which had been offered and accepted as exactly what Clara had insisted it be: honest, mutual, and built to last. The Morrison son came down from Cheyenne and brought his wife, who Clara hadn't met, a small, quiet woman who shook Clara's hand and held it and said, "What you did for these families," and couldn't finish the sentence. And Clara held her hand and said it needed doing, and left it there. Pete Duval wore his good shirt and kept pulling at the collar and grinning in the uncontrolled way of someone who is too happy to manage their face properly. Holloway stood in the back in his best clothes and held his hat and looked at the ground occasionally when things got to be too much, which was his way, and Clara understood his way and was glad he was there. Dale Renfrew stood up straight the whole time, and when it was over he shook Nate's hand and said "ma'am" and tipped his hat, and that hat tip carried everything he didn't know how to say, and she received it as such. The wedding itself was simple. A minister from Harlan's Creek who was a practical man and kept things moving. Nate said his part in the clear, direct voice of a man who had decided on something and was stating it without decoration. Clara said hers in the steady voice of a woman who meant every word and knew it. When it was done, he looked at her the same way he had in the courtroom, and in the barn, and on the cold porch in October, and she looked back at him without looking away, and there was no calculation in it anymore, no assessment. No waiting, just two people looking at each other with the full knowledge of what they were to each other, and the full intention to continue. On the first morning after, Clara got up before dawn and went to the kitchen and started the stove. The coffee went on. The bread dough she'd set the night before had risen in the cloth, and she punched it down and she taped it with her hands and set it to rise again, and the kitchen filled with the smell of it, warm and yeasty and real. She stood at the counter with her coffee and her mother's recipe book open in front of her, not because she needed it for the bread. She could make the bread in her sleep, had made it in every kitchen she'd ever occupied, but because having it open felt right this morning, like acknowledging something. Her mother had written on the inside cover, just a line in the careful script that Clara had learned to read before she could read anything else. The line said, "The kitchen is where you find out who people really are. Take care of it, and it will take care of you." Clara had read that line more times than she could count, in more kitchens than she could easily name, in circumstances her mother could not have predicted when she wrote it. She looked at it now, in the kitchen of the Broken Spur, which was her kitchen, in the house that was her home, on the ranch that was her land, with the man who was her husband somewhere behind her, coming awake to the smell of coffee and bread the way people came awake to things that belonged to them. She heard his boots on the floor, the familiar weight of them, the rhythm she knew. He came into the kitchen and went to the coffee without ceremony, and poured a cup and stood at the counter near her and looked at the recipe book. "Your mother," he said. "She wrote that when I was about 7, Clara said. I asked her once what she meant by it. She said you find out if people are generous or selfish, patient or hasty, whether they'll share what they have or hold it close." She paused. She said kitchens were where the truth came out because you couldn't pretend in a kitchen. You either fed people or you didn't. Nate was quiet for a moment. "She was right," he said. "She usually was," Clara said. He looked at her. "What you found out about this kitchen?" "What I found out," she said, "was that it was full of people worth feeding." He held her gaze over his coffee cup, and in his eyes she saw something settled and clear and permanent, the look of a man who has found what he was looking for and knows it and is not going anywhere. Outside, the Broken Spur was waking up. She could hear it, the sounds of the bunkhouse, the early movement of men getting to the day's work, the particular sounds of a ranch in early spring that is alive and operational and pointed toward the season ahead. She turned back to the bread. She shaped the loaves with her hands, steady and sure, the way she had shaped every loaf in every kitchen she'd ever stood in, and she slid them into the oven and the heat took them, and the morning moved forward and the ranch moved with it. Clara Whitmore, Clara Brooks, had arrived at the Broken Spur with a cloth bag and a sack of flour and a recipe book and 31 years of a life that had made her exactly who she needed to be. She had not come to be saved. She had not come to be pitied or rescued or handled or overlooked. She had come because a ranch needed feeding, and she knew how to feed things kitchens. People hope that had gone cold, trust that had been broken, a whole community that a greedy man had decided was his to take. She had fed all of it, and now, in the kitchen that was hers, on the land that would hold her name, with the people who had become her family by the most reliable method there is, by choosing each other day after day. And showing up, she stood at the stove in the early morning, and did the next thing, and the thing after that, and the thing after that. That was the secret her mother had known and written down in careful script on the inside cover of a recipe book that had traveled through every hard year of Clara's life without being lost. You take care of what matters, and it takes care of you. And that is not optimism, and it is not luck, and it does not require the world to be fair or easy or kind. It only requires that you decide fully, without reservation, with everything you have, that it is worth doing. Clara had decided, and the life that followed was proof of what a woman can build when she finally stops letting other people decide what she's worth and starts building it herself.